The air in Silver Creek, Colorado, carried the scent of pine smoke and the sharp promise of more snow. It was the winter of 1879, a season that had clenched its fist around the high peaks and refused to let go. Down in the valley, the town glittered, a pocket of defiant light against the immense, looming darkness of the mountains. Inside the Grand Imperial Hotel, the light was golden and warm, spilling from gas chandeliers onto the polished dance floor. Violins wept and laughed, their music a silken thread weaving through the murmur of conversation and the clink of crystal glasses. This was the world of Thomas Harland, and by extension, the world of his wife, Evelyn. Evelyn Harland, known to most as Evie, stood near the grand staircase, a glass of lukewarm champagne held loosely in her gloved fingers. At 26 years old, she possessed a quiet elegance that had been cultivated in the finest schools back east, yet her eyes held a steadiness that was purely of the West. She had learned to read Virgil in the original Latin, but she had also learned to read the sky for an oncoming blizzard. She watched her husband now as he moved through the crowd. Thomas was a supernova in a black wool suit, his smile as bright and valuable as the silver he pulled from the earth. He was handsome, clever, and moved with the absolute certainty of a man who had never known failure. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that money could not only buy anything but could also solve everything. It was a faith as devout as any sermon. She saw him clap a banker on the back, his laughter booming over the string quartet. He was telling a story she had heard before, the one about turning a modest inheritance into a fortune through sheer nerve and foresight. The men around him listened, their faces a mixture of envy and admiration. They all wanted to be Thomas Harland. For a moment, Evie felt a familiar pang of pride, but it was quickly followed by something else, a subtle disquiet that had been her companion for weeks. It was in the whispers. She had caught fragments of them all evening, sharp little splinters of conversation that pierced the festive atmosphere. Two prospectors, their faces still weathered from the sun despite their fine clothes, spoke in low tones near the punch bowl. The price of silver, one had muttered, was as unsteady as a loose stone on a cliff face. The other had just shaken his head, his gaze sweeping the opulent room as if it were already a ghost. Evie saw Mr. Abernathy, the president of the Miners' Bank, standing alone by a frosted window, his expression grim as he stared out into the swirling snow. He was not drinking. He was not celebrating. He looked like a man keeping a vigil. She turned her attention back to the dance floor, where couples spun in a dizzying waltz. The gowns were a riot of color, silk and satin and velvet. The jewels at the throats of the women caught the light, casting tiny, frantic rainbows on the walls. It was a beautiful, brilliant spectacle. But tonight it felt fragile, like a scene painted on thin ice. She felt a touch at her elbow and turned. It was Thomas, his eyes shining. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of wine and confidence. He told her she was the most beautiful woman in the room, a treasure more precious than any silver lode. He said it with such sincerity that she almost forgot the whispers. He took her hand and led her onto the floor, his arm a strong, secure band around her waist. As they danced, she rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes and letting the music carry her. For the duration of one waltz, she allowed herself to believe in the solidity of his world, a world built of brilliance and nerve, where the price of silver only ever went up and tomorrow was always more prosperous than today. But as the final note of the violin faded, she opened her eyes and saw Mr. Abernathy still standing at the window, a statue of impending doom. The next morning, the world was silent and gray. A thick blanket of new snow muffled all sound, and the light that filtered through the bedroom window was pale and thin. Evie woke first. A sense of dread coiled in her stomach. The party felt like a dream from a lifetime ago. She rose and dressed, the chill of the house seeping into her bones. Downstairs, she found Thomas in his study, He was not dressed. He was still in the clothes from the night before, his suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He sat at his large oak desk, staring at a stack of telegrams. His face, usually so animated and full of life, was the color of ash. He did not seem to notice her enter. He just sat there, his shoulders slumped. The brilliant supernova of the previous evening collapsed into a white dwarf. She walked over to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. He flinched, as if her touch had burned him. "It is over," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper that was barely audible. The words hung in the cold air. She asked him what was over. What did he mean? He gestured to the telegrams with a hand that trembled. "The Orion load," he said. "It is empty. Played out. A fraud. The geologists were wrong, or they were liars. The investors in Denver are ruined. The ones here are ruined. We are ruined." Evie felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The Orion load was the heart of their fortune, the mine Thomas had always called his masterpiece. She tried to speak, to offer some word of comfort or reason, but she could not find any. She watched as he swept the telegrams off the desk, a sudden, violent motion that sent papers scattering across the expensive Persian rug. He buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with ragged, dry sobs. It was the sound of a man watching his entire world burn to the ground. She tried to hold him, to tell him that they would find a way, that his fortune was not the sum of who he was, but he pushed her away. He told her she did not understand. Money was everything. It was the only thing. Without it, he was nothing. She was nothing. They were nothing. His words were cruel, born of a terror so profound that it left no room for anything else. Later that morning, they came. 2 men from the miners' bank, led by Mr. Abernathy himself. They were polite, their voices low and regretful, but their eyes were like chips of granite. They carried a ledger and a list. They explained, in calm and measured tones, that because the Orion load had been leveraged to finance all other ventures, the collapse was total. The bank was seizing all assets to cover the debt. The house, the furniture, the carriage and horses, the accounts, everything. Evie stood by the parlor window and watched as the life they had built was methodically unmade. She watched as their cook and their maid packed their own small bags, their faces etched with a pity that felt worse than scorn. She heard the whispers of the neighbors who had gathered on the street, their curiosity a palpable thing. Yesterday, she had been Evelyn Harland, wife of the Silver King. Today, she was the wife of a bankrupt man, an object of gossip and speculation. Thomas did not emerge from his study. He locked the door and refused to speak to anyone. Evie was the one who had to face Mr. Abernathy, who had to listen to the inventory of their failure, who had to nod and pretend she understood the legal terms that were stripping her of her home and her security. She moved through the day in a daze, a strange calm settling over her. It was the calm of the survivor, the part of her that knew how to read the sky for a storm and brace for its impact. Her Eastern education had taught her etiquette, but her Western soul was teaching her endurance. That evening, the house was a hollow shell. Most of the furniture had been tagged with small white labels by the bank. The fires had not been lit, and the cold was relentless. Evie made a small meal of bread and cheese, what little was left in the pantry. She knocked on the study door and left the plate on the floor when Thomas did not answer. He came out an hour later. He had shaved and changed into traveling clothes. His face was a mask, his eyes holding a feverish, desperate light. He told her he was leaving. He said he was going south, maybe to Arizona, where there were rumors of new copper strikes. He would make another fortune, a bigger one this time. He would send for her when he spoke in short, clipped sentences, as if he had rehearsed the words. He was not asking for her opinion. He was informing her of a decision. She looked at him, at this stranger who was her husband, and she felt a sorrow so deep it was almost physical. She asked him not to go. She said they could face this together, here in Silver Creek. They could rebuild, but he shook his head. He could not stay here. He said he could not bear the shame, the looks on people's faces. He was a man who built fortunes, not a man who swept up their ashes. He pulled a small, sealed envelope from his coat pocket and pressed it into her hand. He told her not to open it until tomorrow. It was all he had left to give her. He kissed her then, a brief, cold kiss on the forehead. It was the kiss of a stranger saying goodbye. And then he was gone. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the empty, silent house, a final, definitive period at the end of a chapter of her life. She stood in the hallway for a long time, the unread letter clutched in her hand. The next day, the bank would take formal possession of the house. She would have to leave. She did not know where she would go. She had no family nearby, and the friends she thought she had were the friends of her husband, Fortune, not of Evelyn Harland. She packed a single suitcase, filling it with practical things, a few simple dresses, her warmest woolens, a book of poetry. She left behind the silk gowns and the jeweled hairpins. They belonged to another woman, a woman who had ceased to exist that morning. As she worked, snow began to fall again, thick flakes that swirled against the dark window panes. When she was done, she took one of the oil lamps from the mantelpiece. It was a simple thing, brass and glass, but it was hers. She had bought it herself in a small shop not long after they had arrived in Silver Creek. She lit the wick, and a small, steady flame pushed back the encroaching shadows. A knock came at the door, sharp and impatient. It was one of the men from the bank. He said she had to be out by morning. He was just reminding her. His voice was not unkind, but it was firm. The house was no longer hers. She put on her heaviest coat and her gloves. She picked up her suitcase in one hand and the oil lamp in the other. She did not look back as she stepped out of the house and closed the door behind her for the last time. The street was empty. The town was asleep. The wind howled down from the mountains, whipping the snow into a frenzy. It tore at her coat and stung her face. The flame inside the lamp trembled, shrinking from the assault of the wind. For a moment, she thought it would go out, leaving her in total darkness, but it held. The small, fragile light wavered and danced. But it did not die. It was the only light she had left, a tiny, defiant spark against the vast, cold indifference of the night. She held it tightly and took her first step into the storm, her future an unknown and terrifying country stretching out before her. The road out of Silver Creek was not a road at all, but a vague suggestion of one, a path slowly being erased by the relentless calligraphy of the storm. Each step Evelyn Harland took was a small, desperate battle against the wind and the deepening snow. The cold was a physical presence, a predator that had sunk its teeth into her and was slowly draining the life from her. Her fine leather shoes were soaked through, her feet numb and useless. The hem of her wool coat was frozen stiff, heavy with ice and snow. The world had been reduced to a churning vortex of white. The oil lamp, her one small point of defiance against the night, had long since surrendered. The wind had found a way past the glass, and with a final, desperate flicker, the flame had died, leaving her to the mercy of the monochrome twilight. She stumbled on, driven by a primal instinct to simply move, to put one foot in front of the other, the memory of her husband's cold kiss, the sight of the tagged furniture in her silent home, the whispers of the townspeople. It all faded, subsumed by the singular, overwhelming reality of the cold. She lost all sense of time. The sky was a uniform, unforgiving gray. She could have been walking for an hour or for a day. Her thoughts began to unravel, becoming as formless as the snow that swirled around her. She thought she saw the warm lights of a distant cabin, but it was only a trick of her freezing mind. She thought she heard the sound of violins, the music from the party, but it was only the wind screaming through the pines. Her suitcase grew heavier with each step, until finally, her numb fingers could no longer hold it. She let it fall, watching as the snow began to cover it. A small, dark tombstone marking the burial of her former life. She kept going, her arms wrapped around herself, her body a tight knot of shivering. But the shivering was starting to subside, replaced by a strange and dangerous lethargy. A profound sense of peace began to settle over her. It felt warm and inviting. She knew, in some distant, rational corner of her mind, that this was the final lie the cold told its victims. But she was too tired to fight it. She found a small hollow at the base of a great pine tree, a place slightly sheltered from the worst of the wind. It looked like a comfortable place to rest, just for a moment. She sank into the snow, the whiteness rising up to embrace her. She closed her eyes, and the roaring of the storm softened to a gentle lullaby. The world went dark. Samuel McGraw saw the storm coming hours before it hit. He had been checking his trap lines high on the ridge and knew from the color of the sky and the behavior of the birds that this would be no mere squall. He was a man who lived by such signs, a man who understood the language of the mountains. At 34, his face was a landscape of its own, mapped with the lines of hard sun and harsh winters. His eyes, the color of a faded blue sky, were accustomed to seeing long distances. He lived alone in a small cabin he had built himself. His only companion, a scruffy, intelligent dog of uncertain lineage named Buck. They were heading back down the trail, Sam on snowshoes, Buck bounding ahead, when the dog suddenly stopped. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked, his nose twitching as he tasted the wind. Then he let out a sharp, insistent bark. Sam paused, leaning on his rifle. Buck was not a frivolous barker. He barked at bears, at mountain lions, and at the rare stranger who wandered this far from the beaten path. Sam scanned the trees, his eyes searching for movement. He saw nothing but the endless, hypnotic dance of the falling snow. Buck barked again and bolted, disappearing into a thick stand of pine. Sam followed, his snowshoes making a soft, rhythmic crunching sound. He found the dog in a small clearing, frantically digging at a drift of snow near the base of a large tree. At first, Sam thought he had cornered a rabbit or a fox. Then he saw it, a patch of dark wool, a woman's hand, pale and still, lying on the surface of the snow. He moved quickly, his usual deliberate pace abandoned for a sudden urgency. He brushed the snow away and found her. She was curled on her side, half buried, her face as white as the snow she was lying in. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. For a long moment, he felt nothing. Then, a faint, thready beat, as fragile as a bird's wing. She was alive, barely. He looked around. There were no tracks but her own, already half obliterated. She was alone. He did not waste time wondering who she was or what she was doing out here. The mountain was not a place for questions. It was a place for action. With a grunt, he lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a small, cold bundle. He wrapped her in his own heavy coat and started for his cabin, Buck leading the way. The cabin was not far, but in the teeth of the blizzard. It felt like a world away. Evelyn drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if surfacing from a deep, dark body of water. The first thing she was aware of was warmth, a steady, penetrating heat that seemed to be soaking into her very bones. The second thing was a smell. Wood smoke, coffee, and something else, something savory and unfamiliar. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy, as if weighted down with lead. She heard a low, rhythmic thumping sound nearby, and a soft whine. Finally, she managed to pry her eyes open. The light was dim, coming from a fire that crackled in a large stone hearth across the room. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered with a thick pile of woolen blankets and what felt like a heavy animal pelt. She turned her head and saw a large, shaggy dog sitting on the floor beside her, its tail thumping a soft, steady rhythm against the wooden planks. The dog whined again, a sound of gentle inquiry. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her muscles aching in protest. The room was small and spare. The walls were made of rough-hewn logs, the spaces between them chinked with mud and moss. There was a simple wooden table and 2 chairs, a few shelves holding tins and jars, and not much else. It was the home of a man who owned only what was necessary. And then she saw the man. He was standing by the fire, his back to her, stirring something in a black iron pot that hung from a hook. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his clothes simple and worn. When he turned, she saw a face that looked as if it had been carved from the same timber as the cabin walls. He had a thick, untrimmed beard and dark hair that fell over his forehead. His expression was unreadable, his eyes watchful. He was not a man from her world. He was a man from the mountains, and he looked as solid and unyielding as they did. He saw that she was awake. Without a word, he ladled some of the steaming contents of the pot into a wooden bowl. He brought it to her, along with a tin mug of black coffee. He set them down on a small crate beside the cot. His movements were economical, efficient, without any wasted motion. He said his name was Sam. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep in the earth. She found her own voice, and was surprised by how weak and scratchy it sounded. She asked him where she was. He told her she was in his cabin. He had found her in the snow. He said she was lucky. Another hour and she would have been past finding... She looked at the bowl. It was a thick soup, full of corn and what looked like rabbit meat. The smell was rich and comforting. She was hungrier than she had ever been in her life. She took the bowl and began to eat, the hot soup warming her from the inside out. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it cleared the fog from her head. When she had finished, she felt more human. She looked at this silent, watchful man, and the manners of her old life reasserted themselves. She was a guest in his home, a stranger who owed him her life. She had to say something. She asked him, her voice a little stronger now, "Did you save me out of kindness?" He considered the question for a moment, his expression unchanging. Then, a corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "No," he said, "I saved you because my dog here would not stop barking. He said you smelled of cheap wine." The word struck her like a slap. Cheap wine. After everything she had been through, the loss, the fear, the cold, this was the insult that broke through her strange calm. Her back stiffened. A flush of anger, hot and sharp, rose in her cheeks. She was Evelyn Harland. She had served the finest French vintages at her table. She had never tasted cheap wine in her life. She told him so. Her voice laced with an indignation that felt ridiculous even to her own ears. For the first time, he truly smiled. It was not a smile like her husband's, a bright, polished thing meant to charm and persuade. It was a slow, quiet smile that seemed to start deep inside him and work its way out, crinkling the corners of his eyes, and then he laughed, a short, deep bark of a laugh that seemed to startle even him. The sound was so unexpected, so genuine, that it shattered the tension in the small cabin, despite herself. Evie felt an answering smile tug at her own lips, the ice between them, which a moment before had felt as thick as a frozen river, had begun to crack. She felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She looked down at her hands, which were resting on top of the rough wool blanket. Her left hand was bare. The plain gold band that had been on her finger for 5 years was gone. She remembered the cold, the numbness in her fingers. It must have slipped off in the snow, lost forever. The final, tangible link to her old life, to the woman she had been, was gone. A wave of desolation, more profound than anything she had felt yet, washed over her. She did not realize she had made a sound until she saw Sam's gaze on her hand. He saw the missing ring, and he seemed to understand. He looked at her, his expression no longer amused, but serious. He sat down in the chair across from the cot, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. He said there are things money can buy, but they do not last, and there are things no amount of money can touch. His words were simple, spoken without any particular emphasis, as if he were merely stating a fact, like the sun rising in the east or the snow falling in winter. But to Evie, they were a revelation. Thomas had lived his life by the creed that money was the ultimate power, the ultimate reality. He had built a world on that foundation, and she had lived in it with him. And now that world was gone, vanished overnight, as ephemeral as a puff of smoke. She looked at this man, this gentle prospector who lived a life of such stark simplicity. He owned nothing that Thomas would have considered valuable, yet he had a warmth in his cabin, a loyalty in his dog, and a quiet certainty in himself that seemed more real, more solid than all the silver in the Orion lode. She did not fully understand what he meant, not yet, but she felt the truth of his words settle deep within her, a small, hard kernel of knowledge in the vast emptiness of her loss. She was in a strange cabin with a strange man, with no past to return to and no future to imagine. But for the first time since the world had fallen apart, she felt the faint, unfamiliar stirring of something that was not despair. It was a feeling of profound and unsettling wonder. The storm did not pass. It settled over the mountains like a vast, predatory bird, digging its claws in and refusing to let go. For 3 weeks, the world outside the small cabin was a maelstrom of wind and snow. The days were a dim, gray twilight, and the nights were an absolute, roaring blackness. They were utterly and completely cut off, 2 souls adrift in a sea of white. The silence inside the cabin was a fragile truce against the constant howl of the wind, a sound that seemed to be trying to tear the logs apart and reclaim the small pocket of warmth they had created. In this compressed world of firelight and shadows, a new and unfamiliar rhythm began to take shape. For Evelyn Harland, it was a rhythm of survival, and every beat of it was a challenge to the woman she had once been. Her hands, which had known only the smooth touch of piano keys and the delicate pull of an embroidery needle, were now plunged into soapy water to scrub gritty tin plates. She learned the particular smell of pine kindling as it caught fire, a scent far more potent and real than any French perfume she had ever worn. Pride, she discovered, was a useless commodity in this new economy. It could not keep the fire going or melt snow for drinking water. It was a currency from a foreign land, and it had no value here. Her first attempt at helping was a disaster. Sam was outside, clearing a path to the woodpile, and Evie decided she would be useful. She took the smaller of the 2 axes and approached a round of ponderosa pine. She remembered seeing men chop wood, the seemingly effortless swing and the satisfying crack of the splitting log. She lifted the axe, aiming for the center. The blow was clumsy. Glancing off the wood and jarring her arms to the shoulder, she tried again, her frustration mounting. This simple, essential task was beyond her. On the 3rd swing, driven by a surge of anger at her own helplessness, the axe slipped in her uncalloused hands. The sharpened edge sliced across the back of her left hand, opening a shallow but clean cut. She cried out, more in surprise than in pain, and dropped the axe. The blood welled up, a shocking bright crimson against the paleness of her skin and the whiteness of the snow. Sam was there in an instant, his face a mask of concern. He took her hand in his touch surprisingly gentle for a man whose palms were as tough as old leather. He led her back inside, sat her by the fire, and silently began to tend to the wound. He washed it with clean, warm water and a bit of soap. His movements were awkward, his large fingers fumbling slightly with the small strip of cloth he was using for a bandage. There was a clumsiness to his care that was more touching than any polished gesture would have been. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to tending his own wounds, and this act of caring for another seemed both foreign and deeply instinctual to him. As he wrapped the cloth around her hand, he did not speak, but his touch conveyed a quiet, steady reassurance. Evie found herself watching his bent head, the way his dark hair fell over his brow, and felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. The days fell into a pattern. Sam would hunt and trap, always returning with a rabbit or a grouse to add to their dwindling supplies. Evie would keep the fire, cook their simple meals, and try to bring a semblance of order to the small cabin. She learned to bake a dense, heavy bread on the hearthstone and to make a passable stew from dried beans and salted meat. She discovered a different kind of satisfaction in these tasks, a sense of accomplishment that was immediate and tangible. Creating a warm meal from next to nothing felt more significant, somehow, than hosting a successful dinner party for 20 guests. The evenings were the longest. They would sit by the fire, the only light in the vast, stormy darkness. Buck, the dog, would lie between them, his head on his paws, content in the presence of his two humans. For the first week, the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the vast differences in their lives. But slowly, the silence began to change. It became less of an emptiness and more of a shared space, a comfortable quiet that did not need to be filled with chatter. One night, as the wind rattled the single window pane, Evie found the courage to ask a question that had been hovering in her mind. She asked him why he lived here, so far from everything. She had meant it as a simple question, but she saw from the look on his face that the answer was anything but simple. He stared into the fire for a long time, the flames dancing in his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of its usual gruffness. He told her he had not always been alone. He had lived in a mining camp in California during the first big gold rush. It was a place of mud and noise and feverish hope. It was also a place of sickness. He had a wife, he said. Her name was Sarah, and they had a son, a little boy named Daniel. He spoke of them in simple, declarative sentences, as if he were listing facts from a book. Sarah had hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could make you forget you had not seen the sun in a week. Daniel was a serious little boy who loved to collect shiny rocks, convinced each one was a nugget of gold. They had a small tent, and they were saving to buy a piece of land, a real farm with green grass and a creek. Then the fever came to the camp. It moved through the crowded tents and filthy streets like a wildfire. There was no doctor, no medicine, just desperation. Sarah got it first. He had done what he could, but it was not enough. He had held her hand as the life faded from her, her last breath a soft sigh. 2 days later, Daniel was gone too. He had died in Sam's arms, his small body burning with a heat that nothing could cool. Sam fell silent. He did not look at Evie. He just continued to stare into the fire, his jaw tight. He said that after he had buried them, he had walked away from the camp. He had left behind his claim, the small bag of gold dust he had accumulated. Everything. The gold had brought them there, and it had brought them nothing but misery. He had walked until he found these mountains, a place so vast and quiet that it could hold the size of his grief. He had built this cabin with his own hands, and he had lived here ever since, finding a measure of peace in the solitude. Evie listened, her heart aching with a pain that was both for him and for herself. When he finished his story, a single tear traced a path down her cheek, and then another. Soon, she was crying, the silent, suppressed tears of the past weeks finally breaking free. She wept for the husband she had lost, not to death, but to a failure of spirit. She wept for the life that had been snatched away from her, and she wept for this quiet, solitary man and the unimaginable sorrow he carried. She was crying for the loss of a fortune built on silver and gold, while he was mourning a treasure that was utterly priceless. And in that moment, she understood. The simple, unspoken kindness he had shown her, a stranger he had pulled from the snow, was a form of wealth she had never known. It was a quiet strength, a deep and abiding humanity that was more warming, more life-giving than all the precious metals in the world. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside the cabin, something had shifted. A barrier had been broken. Later that night, Evie fell asleep on her cot, exhausted from her emotional release. The fire had burned low, and a draft snaked across the floor. She shivered in her sleep. Sam, who had been sitting in his chair, watching the embers, rose and quietly took the heavy bearskin from his own bed. He draped it over her, tucking it in around her shoulders. As he did, his hand brushed against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, a fleeting contact of rough, calloused skin against hers, but it sent a jolt through her, even in her sleep, in the dim light of the oil lamp, its flame flickering as if in response. The small, simple gesture felt momentous, an act of profound and gentle intimacy. The next day, she found an old, half-empty ledger and a sharpened pencil nub on one of Sam's shelves. She asked if she might use it. He had just nodded, his eyes questioning but not intrusive. She began to write. She wrote about the storm, about the cabin, about the strange new life she was living. She wrote about her own foolish pride and her slow, painful discovery of what it meant to be strong. And as she wrote, she found herself putting into words the realization that had come to her the night before. She wrote, "He has given me something money cannot buy." The final week of their confinement passed in a new kind of harmony. The silence was now easy, companionable. They worked together, moving in a rhythm of shared existence. He would show her how to read the tracks of a snowshoe hare in the fresh snow. She would read to him in the evenings from the single book of poetry she had brought with her. His quiet attention was a greater compliment than any applause she had ever received. A feeling was growing between them, as silent and persistent as the roots of a pine tree pushing through rock. It was not spoken. It was not named. It was simply there, a warmth that had taken root in the heart of a long and unforgiving winter. Then, one morning, she awoke to a new sound. It was the soft, steady drip, drip, drip of melting snow from the eaves of the cabin, a sliver of pale sunshine, the first she had seen in weeks, cut through the window and lay like a golden bar across the wooden floor. The storm had broken. The great white bird had finally released its grip on the mountains. Spring was coming. As the snow receded over the next few days, revealing the wet, brown earth beneath, Evie felt a change within herself. The world was opening up again, and she knew she could not stay hidden in these mountains forever. Her past was still waiting for her down in the valley, in the muddy streets of Silver Creek. It was a ghost she had to face. She had fled the town in shame and despair, a broken woman running from the ruins of her life. But she would not be that woman anymore. She had survived the storm, both outside and within. She felt a new strength, a quiet resilience she had not known she possessed. She knew she had to go back. She had to stand in that town, not as the wife of a ruined man, but as herself, Evelyn Harland, and decide what new life she would build from the ashes of the old. The journey down from the high country was a slow descent into a different world. The pristine, absolute silence of the snowbound peaks gave way to the sound of a world awakening from a long and brutal sleep. Water trickled and then rushed, carving new paths through the snow. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting pine needles. Evelyn walked beside Samuel, her steps more certain now, her body hardened by the weeks of survival. He did not speak much on the way down, but his presence was a constant, solid thing, a quiet reassurance against the uncertainty that lay ahead. She found herself watching him, the easy way he moved through the wilderness, his gaze constantly scanning, reading the landscape as she might read a book. He was a part of this place, and for a short time, she had been a part of it with him. But now they were leaving that world behind. As they emerged from the tree line and saw Silver Creek spread out in the valley below, it was not the glittering jewel she remembered. The great thaw had come, and the town looked raw and exposed. The streets that had been packed with clean, white snow were now rivers of thick, brown mud. The buildings seemed to sag, their paint peeling, their windows dark and unwelcoming. It was a town waking up with a headache, stripped of its festive finery and forced to face the gray light of a difficult morning. A sense of dread, cold and familiar, began to creep back into Evie's heart. Their entry into town did not go unnoticed. A few people stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of curiosity and open hostility. The whispers started almost immediately, a low, ugly murmur that followed them down the main street. Evie kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her back rigid, feeling the weight of their judgment like a physical blow. She was no longer Mrs. Thomas Harland, the charming hostess. She was the woman he had left behind, a living reminder of broken promises and lost fortunes. The first direct confrontation came outside the Mercantile. A woman Evie recognized as the wife of a prominent investor. A woman who had complimented her Parisian gown at the party just weeks before, saw her coming and deliberately turned her back, her face set in a mask of contempt. A moment later, two miners, their clothes caked with mud and their faces grim, blocked their path. One of them, a big man with a red beard, spat a wad of tobacco into the mud near Evie's feet. He looked her up and down, his eyes filled with a raw, ugly anger. He said, "So the Queen of Silver Creek has returned." He asked her where her husband was. He asked if he was off spending their money, the money he had stolen from honest working men. Evie froze, the man's words striking all the air from her lungs. She could feel the eyes of everyone on the street fixed on her. She was a spectacle, a pariah. The second man stepped closer, his voice a low snarl. He said they heard Thomas had run off like a coward. He said that made her something worse. He suggested that she knew all along that the mine was a sham, that she had been a part of the deception. Before Evie could even think of a response, Sam moved. It was not a sudden or a violent motion. He simply stepped in front of her, placing himself between her and the two men. He did not say a word. He just stood there, his stillness more intimidating than any threat. He was not as large as the red-bearded man, but there was a density to him, a sense of rootedness, as if he were an extension of the mountains themselves. He met their angry stares with a calm, unwavering gaze that held no fear and no malice. It was the gaze of a man who had faced down blizzards and bears, and found two angry miners to be of little consequence. The red-bearded man blustered for a moment, telling Sam this was none of his affair, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something in Sam's silence that unnerved him, that took the fire out of his righteous anger and left only the bitter ashes of his own poor judgment. After a long, tense moment, the two miners exchanged an uneasy glance, muttered something under their breath, and pushed past them, disappearing into the saloon. The street was quiet again, but the whispers continued. Sam looked at Evie. He asked her if she was all right. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He had protected her, not with fists or threats, but with the simple, unassailable fact of his own character. In that moment, she felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. They found a place to live on the edge of town, a small, neglected cabin that had been empty for years. It was little more than a single room with a leaky roof and a stone fireplace that drew poorly, but the rent was cheap, paid for with the last of the money from the letter Thomas had left her, and it was a place of their own. They spent the first few days making it habitable, patching the roof with scavenged shingles and chinking the logs with fresh mud. The work was hard, but it was honest, and at the end of each day, as they sat before a small, smoky fire, they could look at what they had accomplished with a sense of weary pride. Starting over meant finding work, and for both of them, it was a lesson in humility. Sam, with his years of experience, found a job as a mucker in a new silver strike that had opened up on the far side of the valley. It was grueling, back-breaking labor, deep in the dark and dangerous tunnels of the earth, for a wage that was a pittance compared to what a man could make on his own claim. But it was steady work, and he took it without complaint. For Evie, the path was more difficult. She had no practical skills, only the accomplishments of a lady of leisure, but she had her needlework. Her stitches were fine and even, a skill she had cultivated over long, quiet afternoons in her parlor. She took her last few coins and bought a length of sturdy cotton and some thread. She made a simple work shirt, the kind the miners wore, putting all of her skill into its construction. Then, swallowing her pride, she took the shirt to the mercantile and showed it to the owner, a stern, practical woman named Martha. Martha inspected the shirt, her expert eyes missing no detail. She tugged at the seams, examined the buttonholes, and finally gave a curt nod of approval. She could not offer Evie a job. She said, not with business so slow, but she would take any mending work that came her way and pass it along. And so Evie became a seamstress. She sat for long hours in the dim light of their small cabin, her fingers growing sore and calloused as she patched torn trousers, replaced missing buttons, and darned woolen socks. The work was tedious and isolating, and the pay was barely enough to keep them in beans and flour. The women who brought her their mending were often the same ones who whispered about her in the street. They treated her with a mixture of pity and condescension, their kindness a thin veil over their morbid curiosity. But Evie persevered. With each stitch, she felt herself knitting together the frayed edges of her own life. And one afternoon, as she finished a particularly difficult patch on a child's coat and saw that it was strong and neat, a genuine smile touched her lips. It was a small, quiet thing, but it was real. It was the first time she had truly smiled since the night of the party. A month after their return, a rumor drifted into town, carried by a traveling salesman. It was a piece of news from the South, a story about a man who had been found dead near the Mexican border, a man who fit the description of Thomas Harland. There was no official confirmation, no body, just the story. But in a town starved for gossip, the story took root and grew into fact. Thomas Harland was dead. When Evie heard the news, her reaction was a confusing tangle of emotions. There was a sharp, undeniable pang of grief. It was not for the man who had abandoned her, but for the charming, ambitious young man she had married, the man who had believed he could conquer the world. That man had been dead to her for some time, but this news was a final, brutal confirmation. Yet, beneath the grief, there was something else, a profound and unsettling sense of relief. A heavy weight she had not even been fully aware she was carrying was suddenly lifted. She was free. The last tie to her old life, a life of wealth and illusion, had been severed. She was no longer waiting for a husband who would never return. She was simply Evelyn, a woman with a needle and thread, and a future that was entirely her own to make. Their life was hard. The town continued to treat them as outcasts. They were the fallen woman and the poor prospector, a source of cautionary tales and moral judgment. But their isolation forged a bond between them that was stronger than any social acceptance. Their small cabin became their entire world, a sanctuary of shared warmth and quiet understanding. One evening, after a simple meal of bean stew and cornbread, Sam took something from the small sack where he kept his few personal belongings. It was an old, battered harmonica. He sat on the floor by the fire and began to play. The music was simple, a plaintive, lonely melody that spoke of wide-open spaces and long, solitary nights. It was a sound that was both sad and beautiful, and it filled the small cabin with a sense of profound peace. Evie sat and listened, watching the firelight flicker on his weathered face, and felt a happiness so pure and simple it brought tears to her eyes. This, she thought, this is real. This little room, this humble meal, this simple music, this is a kind of wealth I never knew existed. A few nights later, Sam came home from the mine, his face gray with exhaustion. He washed the grime from his hands and face in the basin, and then sat down at the small table where Evie was finishing a piece of mending. He reached into his pocket and placed a small object on the table. It was a stone, no bigger than her thumb, but it glittered in the lamplight. It was shot through with a vein of pure, gleaming gold, a small nugget. He said he had found it in a seam of quartz. It was not much, he said, but he wanted her to have it. She picked it up, It was heavy for its size and warm from his hand. She looked at him, her eyes questioning. In a town where gold was the ultimate prize, the reason for all this struggle and hardship, a gift like this was no small thing. He seemed to understand her unspoken question. He reached out and gently closed her fingers over the nugget. "Not for selling," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For remembering." She looked from the gold in her hand to the man sitting across from her. She thought of her lost wedding band, a perfect, polished circle of gold that had symbolized a life of security and status. It was gone, buried in the snow. And now she held this, a rough, unrefined piece of the earth, a gift with no monetary purpose. It was not a symbol of a contract or an investment. It was a symbol of shared survival, of a quiet, unspoken promise. She began to dream, for the first time, of a different kind of life, a simple, humble existence, built not on the shifting fortunes of silver and gold, but on the solid, unyielding bedrock of a good man's heart. But even as the dream began to take shape, a shadow of her past lingered, a cold whisper that reminded her how quickly even the most solid ground could give way beneath her feet. The seasons in the high country do not change gently. They turn on a knife's edge. The brief, muddy spring had given way to a summer of fierce, clear light and sudden thunderstorms. The rhythms of Evelyn and Samuel's life had settled into a steady, quiet cadence, a harmony of shared work and companionable silence. The small cabin was no longer a temporary shelter, but a home. Its rough-hewn walls saturated with the smell of wood smoke, baking bread, and the wild herbs Evie had gathered and hung from the rafters to dry. The whispers in town had not ceased, but they had faded, becoming a dull, background noise to which Evie had grown accustomed. Her world had shrunk to the size of this small cabin, this patch of earth, and the quiet, steady presence of the man who shared it with her. She had found a measure of peace. And then, one late afternoon as the sun bled gold and orange across the western peaks, the ghost of her past walked out of the trees. She was outside, tending to a small, struggling vegetable garden she had coaxed from the rocky soil, when Buck suddenly shot to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Evie looked up, following his gaze, and saw a man standing at the edge of the clearing. He was thin, his clothes ragged and coated with the dust of long travel. A thick, unkempt beard covered the lower half of his face, but even through the grime and the desperation that clung to him like a shroud, she knew him. Her heart seized in her chest, a cold, hard fist of shock and disbelief. It was Thomas. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes fixed on her. They were not the confident, brilliant eyes she remembered. They were the eyes of a haunted man, filled with a feverish, hunted look. He looked at her, at the simple, patched dress she wore, at her dirt-smudged hands, and a flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. He looked at the cabin, his gaze dismissive and contemptuous, before it settled back on her. He said her name, just a single word, a hoarse whisper that the wind almost carried away. Evelyn. She did not move. She felt as if the earth had locked her feet in place. This was a man the world believed to be dead. This was a man she had mourned, and for whom she had felt a strange and liberating relief. And now he was here, a specter made of flesh and blood, standing on the threshold of the new life she had so painstakingly built. He took another step, and then another, until he was standing just a few feet away from her. The smell of cheap whiskey and desperation rolled off him. He told her he had heard she was here. He said it had taken him weeks to find her. He had been in Arizona, he explained, in a series of short, disjointed sentences. The copper strike had been a bust, another false promise. He had been cheated, betrayed. He was in debt. His words were a litany of blame, a catalogue of grievances against a world that had failed him. And then he told her why he had come back. He said he had a plan. He had connections in Denver, men who still remembered the name Thomas Harland. He could rebuild, he could get it all back. But he needed one thing. He needed her. He needed his wife. He asked her to come back to him, to be his wife in name only. Her reputation, he said, was still intact. She was the blameless, abandoned woman. With her by his side, he could regain a foothold, reclaim his good name. It was a business proposition, delivered with the same cool calculation with which he had once discussed the price of silver. Evie stared at him, at this man who was her husband, and she felt nothing of the old affection, only a vast and desolate pity. He was not asking for her love or her forgiveness. He was asking to use her, to leverage her good name as he had once leveraged his mind's. He still saw the world, and everyone in it, as an asset to be managed. Before she could answer, the cabin door opened, and Sam stepped out. He had been inside, cleaning his rifle. He took in the scene in a single, swift glance. Evie's pale, shocked face, the ragged stranger, the tension that crackled in the air. He did not speak. He simply came and stood beside her, a silent, solid presence. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he looked at Sam, taking in his worn clothes, his calloused hands, the quiet way he stood beside Evie. A slow, ugly sneer twisted his lips. He looked from Sam back to Evie, and a new, venomous understanding dawned in his eyes. "So this is it," Thomas said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You have traded a mansion for a hovel, a king for a common laborer." He gestured at Sam. "What could this man possibly give you?" The words hung in the quiet air. Evie felt a hot surge of anger, a protective instinct so fierce it surprised her. But it was Sam who felt the blow most keenly. Evie saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, a shadow of the old insecurities she had seen when they first returned to town. He was a good man, a strong man, but he was also a man who knew the world's harsh calculus. He knew that by every measure Thomas valued. He was nothing. He was just a ragged miner. He remained silent, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Evie found her voice. She told Thomas that he was wrong. She said that Sam had given her a place of safety when she had none. He had treated her with a kindness she had not deserved. Thomas laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Kindness," he scoffed. "Kindness does not put a roof over your head or a fine dress on your back. It is the currency of fools and paupers." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss meant only for Sam. "She is my wife. She belongs to me, not to some dirt-grubbing prospector who lives in a shack. You will not have her." That night, the small cabin felt crowded, suffocating. Sam was a stranger to her. He was withdrawn, wrapped in a stony silence she could not penetrate. He sat by the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes, his face a grim, unreadable mask. The easy companionship they had built over the months was gone, replaced by a chasm of unspoken words and wounded pride. Evie knew he was hurting. She knew that Thomas's cruel words had struck at the heart of his own quiet insecurities, but she did not know how to reach him. Later, unable to bear the tension, Sam left. He said he was going into town for some tobacco, but Evie knew it was an excuse. He was fleeing the confines of the cabin, fleeing the ghost that had taken up residence there with them. An hour passed, and then another. A knot of anxiety tightened in Evie's stomach. She put on her shawl and started down the path toward town, the lantern in her hand casting long, dancing shadows. As she neared the saloon, she heard it, the sound of angry voices, a crash of breaking glass, and then the dull, ugly thud of fists meeting flesh. She began to run. She emerged into the muddy main street to see a small crowd gathered outside the saloon. In the center of the circle, illuminated by the spill of light from the doorway, were Sam and Thomas. They were locked in a desperate, clumsy struggle. Thomas, fueled by whiskey and bitter rage, was flailing wildly. Sam, his face set and grim, was trying to fend him off, his movements economical and defensive. But then Thomas lunged, and Sam stumbled. As he put out his hand to break his fall, It crashed through the saloon's front window. He cried out, a sharp exclamation of pain, and pulled his hand back. It was bleeding freely, torn open by a shard of glass. The sight of the blood seemed to break the spell. The fight was over. Thomas staggered back, his chest heaving, a thin trickle of blood running from the corner of his mouth. Sam stood, cradling his injured hand, his face pale beneath the grime. The crowd began to murmur, their morbid curiosity satisfied. Evie pushed her way through the onlookers and went to Sam. She took his arm without a word and led him away. Back up the dark path to their cabin, Thomas watched them go, his face a mask of bitter, impotent fury. Back in the cabin, she gently took his hand. It was a deep, ugly gash, just below the knuckles of his right hand. It was the hand he used to hold an axe, to aim a rifle, to play his harmonica. She cleaned the wound as he had once cleaned hers, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He sat silently, his gaze fixed on her face, watching her as she worked. When she had finished binding the wound with a clean strip of cloth, she looked up and met his eyes. The silence in the room was absolute, profound. In his gaze, she saw all the pain and pride and fierce, unspoken emotion he had been holding back. She saw the depth of his feeling for her, a feeling he felt he had no right to claim. And in that moment, all her own hesitation, all her confusion and lingering sense of duty to the past simply fell away. There was only this man, this quiet, good man who had fought for her, who had been wounded for her. She leaned forward, and her lips met his. It was not a kiss of passion or of promise. It was a kiss of truth. It was as simple and real as the rough texture of his skin and the faint taste of blood on his lips. It was a quiet acknowledgement of everything that had grown between them in the heart of the long winter. A silent confirmation of a bond forged in shared hardship and gentle kindness. When they broke apart, nothing had been said, but everything had been changed. The next morning, Evie knew what she had to do. She walked into Silver Creek, her head held high. She found Thomas in the dining room of the hotel, nursing a cup of coffee and a bruised jaw. He looked up as she approached, a flicker of triumphant hope in his eyes. He thought she had come to accept his offer. She stood before him, not as a supplicant, but as an equal. The whole town could see them through the large front window. Let them watch, she thought. Let them finally see the truth. She spoke, her voice low but clear and steady. You have lost everything. Thomas. He tried to smile, a pathetic imitation of his old, charming grin. It faltered on his bruised lips. No. Evelyn, he said, his voice husky with a sentimentality she now recognized as another form of manipulation. I lost everything the moment you stopped loving me. She looked at him, at the wreckage of the man he had become, and she felt a final, cleansing wave of clarity. No, Thomas, she said, and her voice did not waver. You lost everything the moment you started to treat love like a possession. The last words she spoke to Thomas hung in the air of the hotel dining room long after she had gone. An epitaph for a marriage and a fortune. She had walked away, not looking back, leaving him to drown in the silence and the cold coffee and the ruin he had made. When she returned to the cabin, Samuel was there. He looked at her face, saw the quiet finality in her eyes, and seemed to understand that a great and heavy door had been closed at last. He said nothing, but he took her hand, his thumb gently tracing the back of her knuckles, and in that simple, wordless gesture, she felt the foundation of a new world being laid. For 2 days, a fragile peace settled over them, the quiet after a long and bitter war. Thomas remained in town, a brooding, spectral presence, but he did not come near them again. It was a strange and unstable truce, an emotional calm before a storm of a different kind, and then the sky began to weep. It did not begin as a normal summer rain, with a dramatic overture of thunder and lightning. It began as a low, gray ceiling of cloud that descended upon the peaks and simply opened up. The rain was not a cleansing shower. It was a deluge, a relentless, vertical river pouring from the heavens. It fell with a heavy, monotonous roar on the roof of the cabin, a sound that seeped into the bones and frayed the nerves. By the second day, the small clearing around their home had become a shallow lake, the muddy water creeping higher and higher up the foundation stones. The creek, usually a pleasant, gurgling companion, had turned into a raging, brown torrent, its voice a deep and angry growl. Samuel grew quiet, his usual stillness replaced by a watchful tension. He spent hours standing in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the mountains, his face grim. He knew the signs. He knew the sounds. He had lived in these mountains long enough to understand their language, and what they were saying now was a word of profound and terrible warning. The earth was saturated, unable to drink any more of the ceaseless rain. It was shedding the water, sending it rushing down the canyons and ravines in ever-growing streams. On the third morning, the sound came. It was not the sound of rain or wind or the angry creek. It was a sound that did not belong, a deep, grinding roar that seemed to come from the very gut of the earth. It was a sound of immense and catastrophic failure. Samuel and Evelyn looked at each other, the same terror dawning in their eyes. The old timber dam high up in the canyon, the one that held back a small lake fed by snowmelt, had given way. There was no time to think, only to react. Samuel grabbed her arm. "To the ridge!" He yelled over the rising roar. "Now!" He pushed her out the door and into the knee-deep water. They scrambled up the slick, muddy slope behind the cabin, their feet slipping, their hands clawing at rocks and roots for purchase. When they reached the high ground, they turned and looked down upon Silver Creek. What they saw was the stuff of nightmares. A solid wall of water, a churning, debris-filled monster, was tearing through the valley. It was not a flood, it was an avalanche of liquid, carrying with it entire trees, massive boulders, and the wreckage of the dam itself. It hit the edge of town with the force of 1,000 battering rams. The first few cabins and outbuildings simply vanished, swallowed whole by the brown tide. A sound of splintering wood and screaming rose from the valley, a sound that was almost drowned out by the deafening roar of the water. The town descended into chaos. People poured from their houses, their faces masks of disbelief and terror. The main street became a raging river in seconds. Wagons were lifted and tossed aside like children's toys. Horses and mules, their eyes wide with panic, were swept away in the current. The water, thick as syrup with mud and silt, clawed at the foundations of the larger buildings, pulling them apart, board by board. Samuel did not hesitate. His face was a mask of grim determination. He told Evie to stay on the ridge, to stay safe. Before she could protest, he was gone, half sliding, half running down the treacherous slope and into the maelstrom. She watched in horror and awe as he plunged into the chest-deep current, a solitary figure of strength in the midst of utter chaos. He fought his way to a small house where a family was trapped on the porch, the water rising around them. He took the smallest child, a little girl, and carried her on his shoulders to a patch of higher ground. Then he went back for the others. And then Evie saw something that made her heart stop. Another man had appeared, wading into the flood from the direction of the Grand Imperial Hotel. It was Thomas. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to have burned away all his bitterness and self-pity. He looked like a man who had woken from a long and terrible dream to find the world ending. He saw Samuel struggling to help an elderly couple, and without a moment's hesitation, he plunged into help. The two men, the bitter rivals, worked together, their enmity forgotten. Two human beings fighting against the raw, indiscriminate fury of nature, driven by an instinct she did not understand. Evie began to make her way down the ridge, moving laterally toward the town. She had to help. She could not stand by and watch. She reached the edge of the floodwaters near the Mercantile. where a group of women and children were huddled on the roof of a submerged shed. She saw Martha, the store owner, her face streaked with mud, trying to keep the children calm. As Evie waded through the churning water to help, she heard a terrible groaning sound. The building next to the shed, its foundation eaten away by the flood, began to tilt. It collapsed with a sound like a giant sigh, a cascade of timber and breaking glass. Evie was knocked off her feet, not by the building itself, but by the wave of water it displaced. She was thrown against the wall of another small house. The breath knocked from her lungs. A heavy roof beam, dislodged by the impact, crashed down, pinning her leg. She cried out as a searing pain shot through her. From her ankle to her hip, she was trapped. The cold, muddy water was rising around her, pulling at her skirts, chilling her to the bone. Samuel saw it happen. A primal roar of her name was torn from his throat. He left the people he was helping and fought his way toward her, his movements frantic, desperate. He reached her side and saw the massive beam that held her fast. He put his shoulder to it, his muscles straining, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. It would not budge. The weight was too great. Panic began to claw at him. The water was rising, and he could not free her, just as despair was about to claim him. Thomas was there. He had seen it too. He appeared at Samuel's side, his face a grim mirror of Samuel's own desperation. No words were exchanged. None were needed. They both put their shoulders to the beam, their feet slipping in the slick mud, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Together, they heaved. The beam groaned, shifted a fraction of an inch. They heaved again, a single unified force of will against the dead weight of the timber. Slowly, agonizingly, the beam lifted. Just enough. Samuel screamed at Evie to pull herself free. She clawed her way out from under the crushing weight, her legs screaming in protest. As she cleared the beam, another sound filled the air, a high, sharp crack from above. A larger section of the collapsed roof, which had been held precariously in place, gave way. Thomas, who was in the direct path of the falling debris, did not even have time to cry out. In a final, instinctive act, he shoved Samuel with all his might, pushing him and Evie clear of the danger zone. Then the roof came down, a final, terrible avalanche of wood and shingles. Thomas disappeared beneath it. There was a brief, violent roiling of the water, and then he was gone. The peak of the flood had passed. The rain began to lessen, the terrible roar of the water subsiding to a deep, mournful gurgle. Samuel held Evie in the middle of the ruined street, surrounded by the wreckage of the town and the thick, clinging mud. He held her as if he would never let her go, his body trembling with reaction. And they wept. They wept for the terror and the pain, for the town that had been destroyed, and for the man who had, in his final moments, found a measure of redemption. They cried for the sheer, brutal, and overwhelming miracle of being alive. Evie leaned her head against his chest, the sound of his heart a steady, reassuring drum against her ear. She looked at his face, streaked with mud and tears, at his bandaged hand, at the quiet, unshakable strength that radiated from him even in the midst of this devastation. And in that moment, all the pain and loss of the past months coalesced into a single, shining point of clarity. "Her husband's fortune vanished overnight," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "But you gave me something money could not buy." That night, the survivors of Silver Creek gathered on the hillside above the drowned town. They built a massive bonfire, a single point of defiant light and warmth in the vast, wet darkness. The air was filled with the low murmur of shared stories, of near misses and tragic losses. Evie sat with Samuel, her injured leg propped up and tightly bound. He had his arm around her, and she held his good hand in both of hers. They did not speak. They simply sat, side by side, and watched the flames dance against the night sky. in the shared warmth of the fire, surrounded by the remnants of their community. They both knew, with an absolute and unshakable certainty, that they had found a treasure more precious and more enduring than any vein of silver or gold. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the eastern peaks, it revealed a scene of almost unimaginable devastation. But with the light came a new spirit. A quiet resolve began to spread through the small group of survivors. They were miners and merchants, wives and children. They were a people accustomed to hardship, a people who had carved a life out of the unforgiving rock of the mountains. They had lost almost everything, but they had not lost each other. And as the sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the ravaged valley, the slow, difficult work of rebuilding began. It was a new start, for a town, and for two souls who had found each other in the heart of the storm, in the aftermath of the Great Flood. Silver Creek was a landscape of raw wounds. The valley was a graveyard of splintered timber, upended wagons, and the thick, suffocating blanket of mud that covered everything, erasing the familiar lines of streets and properties. But out of the shared trauma, something new and fragile began to grow. The disaster had been a brutal equalizer. It had not cared about bank accounts or social standing. It had taken from everyone. In the shared work of digging out, the old whispers and judgments died, buried in the mud alongside the wreckage. A person was judged now not by the fortune they had lost, but by the strength in their back and the willingness in their heart. In this new world, Samuel McGraw became, much to his own surprise, a leader. He did not seek the role. He did not give speeches or issue commands. His leadership was of a quieter, more fundamental kind, while other men stood staring at the devastation, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the task ahead. Samuel simply picked up a shovel and began to dig. He started with the house of the oldest couple in town, and within an hour, 3 other men were digging alongside him. By the end of the day, there were 10. He possessed a deep, instinctual knowledge of how to work with the earth, not against it. He knew where to dig channels to drain the standing water, how to brace a wall that was threatening to collapse, how to salvage timbers that looked like hopeless wreckage. Others saw his quiet competence, his tireless energy, and they followed his lead. He became the calm, steady center of the storm of reconstruction. While Samuel worked to rebuild the physical structure of the town, Evelyn worked to mend its broken heart. Her own leg was badly bruised and sprained, but she ignored the pain, binding it tightly and using a scavenged tree branch as a crutch. Her small cabin, perched on the hillside, had been spared the worst of the flood, and it became a sanctuary. She took in 2 young children who had been orphaned when their small homestead was washed away. She fed them, washed the mud from their hair, and held them through the night as they cried for the parents who would not return, the women of the town, who had once looked upon her with scorn and pity, now came to her for help. They brought her what little fabric they had salvaged, and her cabin, once a place of solitary mending, became a workshop of communal hope. She turned stained tablecloths into shirts for the men, ripped blankets into clothes for the children. Her hands were never still. She moved among the grieving and the displaced, offering not platitudes, but practical comfort, a bowl of hot soup, a dry pair of socks, a neatly stitched patch over a tear. The woman who had once been the wife of the Silver King became a mother to a town of orphans. One evening, weeks into the grueling work of rebuilding, she was alone in the cabin. The children were finally asleep, their small bodies curled together on a makeshift pallet near the fire. Samuel was at a meeting with the other men, discussing how to reopen one of the older, smaller mines that had been flooded but not destroyed. In a rare moment of quiet, Evie found the old ledger she had used as a journal during that first terrible winter. She sat by the fire, the sleeping children a soft counterpoint to the crackling flames, and began to read. She read the words of a woman she barely recognized, a woman terrified of the cold, horrified by the roughness of her own hands, consumed with a pride that seemed, now, as foolish and fragile as a china doll. She had written of her despair, her loneliness, her shock at the simple, brutal realities of survival. She had marveled at Samuel's kindness as if it were a strange and exotic artifact. Reading the words now, Evelyn felt a profound sense of distance, as if she were reading a story about someone else entirely. That woman had been afraid of everything. The woman she was now, she realized, was afraid of almost nothing. The flood had taken what little she had left, and in doing so, had given her everything. It had given her a purpose. It had given her a community. And it had given her the love of a good man. She closed the ledger, a slow smile spreading across her face. The woman who had written those first desperate entries was gone, washed away in the flood. And the woman who sat here now, in this small, warm cabin, was home. Their own home, once a symbol of their outcast status, was now just one of many being pieced back together. One clear, bright afternoon, Samuel came home with 2 buckets of whitewash he had bought in a neighboring town. He said that if they were going to stay, they might as well make the place look like it. The work was a celebration. They laughed as they brushed the clean, white paint over the dark, weathered logs. The cabin seemed to brighten, to stand up a little straighter under the summer sun. Samuel, in a moment of playful carelessness, managed to get a streak of white on the end of Evie's nose. She retaliated, dabbing a spot of whitewash on his cheek. Soon they were engaged in a slow, laughing battle, leaving small white marks on each other's clothes and faces. He finally caught her, his arms circling her waist, pulling her close. His face was inches from hers, his eyes crinkling with a deep and gentle amusement. In that moment, surrounded by the smell of wet earth and fresh paint, with the sounds of a town rebuilding itself rising from the valley below, Evie felt a sense of pure, unadulterated joy. This was her life. This was her home. This was her future. The future arrived sooner than they expected. As Samuel and a team of miners worked to clear the mud and debris from the old Morning Star mine, they made a discovery. The flood, in its violent scouring of the earth, had done more than just destroy. It had also revealed. It had torn away a section of rock deep in the oldest tunnel, exposing a vein of quartz unlike any they had seen before. It was thick with glittering yellow seams. It was not silver. It was gold. It was not a small pocket, but a rich and promising lode, a strike that could potentially make any man who owned the claim fabulously wealthy. And because the mine had been abandoned for years, the claim had lapsed by right of discovery. The lode belonged to the man who had found it. It belonged to Samuel McGraw. The news spread through the town like a fever. After so much loss and hardship, it felt like a miracle, a blessing from the very mountains that had so recently tried to destroy them. People clapped Samuel on the back, their faces shining with a vicarious hope. He would be a rich man. He, the quiet mucker, the humble prospector, would be the new Silver King, or rather, the Gold King of Silver Creek. That evening, the cabin was filled with a new kind of tension. Samuel was quiet, but it was not his usual companionable silence. It was the heavy, troubled silence of a man wrestling with the weight of a great decision. Evie watched him as he stared into the fire, his face etched with a conflict she could only guess at. The gold was a promise, a chance to have everything they had never had. It was a chance for security, for comfort, for a life free from the back-breaking labor and the constant, grinding worry of poverty. It was a chance to give the orphaned children in their care a real future. But she saw in his eyes that it was also a burden. She finally broke the silence. She asked him what he was thinking. He looked at her, his gaze deep and searching. He said he had been thinking about Sarah and Daniel. He said he had been thinking about the gold camp in California, the fever, and the small graves he had dug on a muddy hillside. He had come to these mountains to escape gold, to escape the fever that it put in men's souls. And now the mountain had given it back to him. The next day, he called a meeting of the entire town. They gathered in the half-rebuilt Main Street, their faces expectant, eager to hear about their new benefactor's plans. Samuel stood on the porch of the Mercantile, with Evie beside him. He was not a natural speaker, and his words were simple, unadorned. He told them about the strike. He acknowledged that the claim was his by law. He saw the hope in their faces, and he saw the fear too. The old fear that one man's fortune would be built on the backs of others. Then he said, "I have seen what gold can do. It can build a town, and it can build a grave. I have had enough of graves." He took a deep breath. "This load does not belong to me. It belongs to Silver Creek. It is enough for all of us to live and to share. We will work it together, and we will share the profits together. Every man, woman, and child in this valley. We will rebuild this town not on the fortune of one man, but on the strength of all of us." A stunned silence fell over the crowd, and then a single person began to clap, then another and another, until the entire street erupted in a cheer that echoed off the high canyon walls. It was a sound of profound and grateful joy. That evening, as the last light of the sun set the sky on fire, Evie and Samuel stood on the ridge overlooking the valley. The sounds of celebration still drifted up from the town, a town that had been reborn. She turned to him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She laid her hand on his cheek, her thumb stroking his rough beard. "You are a rich man now, Samuel McGraw," she said softly. He smiled, a slow, deep smile that held all the love in the world. He covered her hand with his own, his wounded hand, now scarred but strong. "Rich because I have you," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble, "not because of the gold." The first few months of the Silver Creek Cooperative were a testament to the stubborn resilience of the human spirit. The town, rising from the mud, was not the same place it had been. The frantic, feverish energy of a boomtown was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of a community with a shared purpose. Men who had once viewed each other as rivals now worked side by side in the Morning Star mine. Their fortunes intertwined. The sound of hammers on wood was constant, a percussive score for the town's resurrection. Houses were rebuilt, not with the ostentatious flair of newfound wealth, but with the simple, solid utility of homes meant to last. The gold that came from the mine was not hoarded. It was a communal resource, managed by a council of 5 elected by the townspeople, with Samuel serving as its reluctant but respected head. The profits were used to buy lumber, food, and medicine for everyone. For the first time, Silver Creek felt less like a temporary camp of fortune seekers and more like a real town. Evelyn thrived in this new atmosphere. The constant work had chiseled away the last vestiges of the fragile, ornamental woman she had been. She was lean and strong, her hands capable, her gaze direct. She had officially adopted the 2 orphaned children, a boy named Peter and his younger sister, Sarah, and their small, whitewashed cabin was filled with a life and a warmth it had never known before. She was a mother, a seamstress, a respected voice in the community. She had found a sense of belonging she had never experienced, not even in the grandest drawing rooms of her former life. Her love for Samuel was the quiet, steady fire at the center of it all, a love that needed no grand declarations, for it was lived every day in shared glances, tired smiles, and the simple comfort of his presence beside her in the night. This fragile peace was shattered on a bright afternoon in late autumn by the arrival of a gleaming black carriage, pulled by 2 perfectly matched gray horses. It was an apparition from another world, a world of polish and power that seemed alien in the muddy, half-rebuilt streets of Silver Creek. Out of the carriage stepped a man in a tailored wool suit and a bowler hat. He was trim, with a neat graying mustache and the cool, appraising eyes of a man who calculates the value of everything he sees. He introduced himself to the town council as Mr. Davies, a representative of the Denver Consolidated Bank and Trust. He was polite, even charming, and his words were smooth and reasonable. He told them he had been following the remarkable story of Silver Creek's recovery. He praised their industry and their spirit. Then he got to the purpose of his visit. The bank, he explained, was prepared to make a significant investment in the region. They were interested in purchasing the mining rights to the Morningstar lode. He laid a sheaf of papers on the rough-hewn table in the new town hall. The offer was a staggering sum of money, an amount that made every man in the room draw a sharp, incredulous breath. It was enough to rebuild the town 10 times over, enough to make every man, woman, and child in the valley independently wealthy for the rest of their lives. He presented it not as a hostile takeover, but as a partnership, a way of removing the immense risk and uncertainty of mining from their shoulders and replacing it with the cold, hard certainty of cash. That night, a current of restless energy coursed through Silver Creek. The banker's offer was a lightning bolt that had split their new world in two. For Samuel, it was the return of an old and bitter ghost. For Evelyn, it was the siren song of a life she had thought was lost to her forever. Their argument began quietly. A small, dangerous spark in the warm confines of the cabin. Evie had been putting the children to bed, her movements quick with a nervous energy she could not conceal, when she came and sat by the fire, where Samuel was staring into the flames as he had so many nights before. The words spilled out of her. She told him they had to accept the offer. Her voice was low, urgent, filled with a desperate conviction. She spoke of the children, of the future they could give them. Schools back east, proper clothes, a life free from the fear and uncertainty that had defined their own. She spoke of themselves, of a life where he did not have to risk his life every day in a dark hole in the ground, where her fingers were not raw from a needle. "Sell it, Samuel," she pleaded. "Please, we could be safe, truly safe, for the first time." He did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the fire. When he spoke, his voice was heavy, freighted with a weariness that went deeper than the day's labor. "It is a fortress you want to build, Evelyn, with walls made of gold. But I have seen what happens to men who live in those fortresses. They become prisoners." The spark between them flared into a flame. She moved to stand before him, forcing him to look at her. "A prison," she repeated, her voice rising with a disbelief that bordered on anger. "You call this a prison, this struggle, this constant worry that a rockfall or a sickness or a long winter could take everything away from us again. I have lived without money, Samuel. I have felt the cold of it, the shame of it. This money is not a prison. It is freedom. It is the freedom to never be hungry or afraid again." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not anger, but a deep and profound sadness. He said, "And what of the town? What of the people who have worked alongside me, who have trusted me? This is their dream too. I cannot sell it out from under them." She shot back. "They will be rich. They will thank you for it. They will be free, just as we will. You are being proud. Samuel, you are clinging to an idea while I am talking about our lives." He stood then, his tall frame filling the small cabin, a storm of conflicted emotion on his face. "This is not about pride," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is about what we are building here. We are building a place where a man is not measured by the size of his claim, but by the strength of his character. Where we help our neighbors not because we expect a profit, but because it is the right thing to do. Davies and his bank do not care about that. They will bring in their own men, their own rules. They will suck the gold from that mountain and leave this valley as empty as it was before. We will have traded our souls for a pile of coins." The argument grew more heated, their words a painful clash of two different pasts, two different fears. He saw the corrupting fever of gold. She saw the brutal specter of poverty. "Finally!" Her voice broke, the anger dissolving into a raw, trembling fear that was the true heart of the matter. "I am afraid," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "I am so afraid of losing it all again. I lost a husband to his fortune. I will not lose another. I am afraid of this mine. Samuel, I am afraid of what it will demand of you, of what it will turn you into. I am afraid of losing you." The raw honesty of her words silenced him. He looked at her, His own anger gone, replaced by a look of aching tenderness and profound conflict. He reached out as if to touch her, then let his hand fall to his side. He turned and walked to the door. "I need to think," he said, his voice rough. "I need to go where I can hear my own heart." And then he was gone, swallowed by the immense, star-dusted darkness of the mountains. The 3 days that Samuel was gone were the longest of Evelyn's life. The cabin, which had been her sanctuary, felt empty and cold, despite the fire she kept blazing in the hearth. The children's laughter seemed to echo in the hollow space he had left behind. She went through the motions of her days, cooking, mending, tending to the children, but her mind was in the high country with him. At night, she lay alone on their simple bed. The bearskin he had once laid over her a poor substitute for the warmth of his body. The silence was a heavy blanket, and in it, she was forced to confront the true nature of her fear. She walked through the town, and she saw what he had been talking about. She saw men sharing their tools, women sharing their flour. She saw the new schoolhouse they were building, a project funded by every family contributing what they could. This was not the dream of one man. It was the shared, fragile hope of an entire community. And she had been willing to sell it. The banker's money, which had seemed like a shield, now felt like a cage. A gilded cage she had been trying to pull both herself and Samuel into. She realized, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, that her fear had almost made her betray the very things that had saved her community: shared purpose, and the quiet, unwavering love of a man who valued his integrity more than gold. She did not want a fortress. She just wanted him back. On the evening of the 3rd day, she was standing outside the cabin as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep, bruised purple. She saw a figure emerge from the tree line on the ridge, a solitary man walking with a familiar, steady gait. It was Samuel. He walked toward her, and as he drew closer, she saw that he was carrying something in his hand. It was not a bag of gold nuggets or the deed to a new life. It was a small, wild bouquet of late-season mountain flowers, brilliant splashes of blue and yellow and deep magenta. He stopped in front of her, his face weary from his journey, but his eyes clear and calm. "I cannot sell our dream, Evelyn," he said, his voice quiet but firm. A great, shuddering sob of relief escaped her. The tears that had been threatening for days finally came. Not tears of sorrow, but of gratitude. She threw her arms around his neck and buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of pine smoke and clean mountain air. He held her tightly, his hand stroking her hair. The setting sun bathed them in a light so pure and golden it seemed as if the very air had turned to treasure. The light streamed across the valley, illuminating the humble, whitewashed cabin and the half-rebuilt town, making the ordinary landscape shimmer with an unearthly beauty. It was a kingdom, not of silver or gold, but of second chances. That night, in the quiet warmth of the cabin, the conflict that had torn them apart was healed. The fire cast a soft, flickering glow on the log walls. The children slept peacefully. Samuel took her hand, his thumb gently tracing the scars left by her own foolish attempt at chopping wood. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it. The gesture was more intimate, more profound than any passionate embrace. It was an act of quiet reverence, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had taken, of the woman she had become. There were no more words to be said. They had been tested by the ghosts of their pasts, by the allure of a world they had both escaped, and they had chosen each other. They had chosen this simple, difficult, and beautiful life, in the heart of their small cabin, surrounded by the vast and quiet mountains. They had found a wealth that no banker could ever comprehend, and no disaster could ever take away. The banker, Mr. Davies, left Silver Creek the day after Samuel's town meeting, his gleaming carriage a silent, departing monument to a world of values that no longer held currency here. He left behind a town not of millionaires, but of partners. The shared dream, once tested by the lure of easy wealth, was now stronger, tempered in the fire of that temptation. The autumn that followed was a season of quiet, purposeful labor, a time of healing for the land and the community. The scars of the flood began to fade, covered over by the steady, therapeutic work of human hands. As the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, a new and secret life began to stir within Evelyn. It was a change she felt long before she could name it, a subtle shift in the tides of her own body, a deep and quiet quickening. It was a life conceived not in the perfumed bedrooms of a mansion, but in the humble warmth of a rough-hewn cabin, a life born of a love that had survived disgrace, disaster, and doubt. This was the ultimate symbol of rebirth, a future taking root in the fertile ground of her own transformed soul. She did not tell Samuel at first. She held the knowledge close, a small, warm secret in the cold of the approaching winter. But he knew. He was a man who noticed the subtle shifts of the seasons, the way a deer would move before a storm, the change in the light that foretold the first frost. He noticed the new tenderness in her expression, the way her hand would sometimes rest unconsciously on her abdomen, the soft, inward-looking smile that would touch her lips when she thought no one was watching. One evening, as she sat mending a shirt for young Peter, a wave of weariness washed over her so suddenly and completely that she let her sewing fall into her lap and closed her eyes. Samuel, who had been carving a piece of wood by the fire, put down his knife. He came and knelt before her, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers where it rested in her lap. He did not ask. He did not need to. He simply looked at her, his gaze filled with a profound and gentle wonder that was more eloquent than any words. She smiled, a tear of pure, unadulterated joy slipping down her cheek, and nodded. In that shared, silent moment, their future was sealed. The next day, Samuel began to build a new room onto the cabin. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his axe and saw moving with a new kind of purpose. He was not just building a shelter, he was building a nest. He salvaged the best timbers from the flood's wreckage, planing them down until they were smooth and clean, imbued with a history of survival. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Evie would see him sitting by the fire, his hands, which were so accustomed to the rough work of the mine, struggling with a needle and a square of soft, bleached flour sack. He was sewing small, simple cloths, his brow furrowed in concentration, his stitches clumsy but full of a fierce and tender love. Watching him, Evie's heart felt a kind of sweet, painful ache, a love so deep and real it was almost overwhelming. While their own small family prepared for its new arrival, the larger family of Silver Creek was also growing and prospering. The cooperative mine was a success beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The town was bustling. The main street was no longer a river of mud, but a properly graded road, lined with new buildings. A new mercantile had been built, larger than the old one, its shelves stocked with goods paid for by the communal fund. The sounds of a blacksmith's hammer and a sawyer's blade were the town's new music. Most importantly, the people were united. The shared ownership of the mine had erased the old lines between owner and worker, rich and poor. They were all in it together, their successes and failures intertwined. A sense of optimism, as real and tangible as the gold they pulled from the earth, permeated the crisp mountain air. Evelyn's role in this new community had solidified. With the new schoolhouse built, she had become the town's teacher. Every morning, she would walk with Peter and Sarah to the simple, one-room building where a dozen other children were waiting. She taught them their letters and their numbers. But more than that, she taught them stories. She told them tales not of kings and queens, but of pioneers who had crossed the plains, of men and women who had faced hardship with courage and kindness. She spoke of the importance of community, of how a bundle of sticks is stronger than any single branch. In the faces of these children, the future of Silver Creek, She saw the hope of a world built on the lessons she herself had learned in the most difficult of ways. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows from the peaks, Samuel took her to a small, flat clearing a little way up the mountain. In his hand, he carried his old rifle. He told her it was time she'd learn to shoot. She laughed, the idea seeming absurd. She was a teacher, a mother. What did she need with a gun? He insisted, his expression gentle but serious. "This is a hard country," he said. "A person ought to know how to rely on themselves. It is not about fighting. It is about being capable." He showed her how to hold the heavy rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder. His body was warm and solid behind hers as he helped her aim, his hands guiding hers, his breath stirring her hair. The intimacy of the moment was profound. This was not a man trying to dominate her, but a partner trying to empower her. He stood back. She took a deep breath, sighted on a distant pine cone, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with a deafening roar, and she saw the pine cone explode in a small puff of dust. A wide, incredulous grin spread across her face, followed by a peal of laughter, a sound of pure, uninhibited freedom that echoed in the quiet evening air. In that moment, she was not the refined Mrs. Harland, nor the desperate refugee from the storm. She was just Evelyn, a woman of the mountains, strong, capable, and free. A few weeks later, they were married. There was no church, no fancy dress, no crowd of polite, whispering guests. The ceremony was held in a high mountain meadow, surrounded by the great, silent cathedral of the peaks. The only attendees were a dozen of their closest friends from the town and the 3 children, who served as their witnesses. The preacher was an old, circuit-riding minister who happened to be passing through. The afternoon sun was their stained glass, and the wind in the pines was their organ music. They exchanged simple, handwritten vows, promising not a life of ease, but a life of shared burdens, honest work, and unwavering partnership. When Samuel slipped a simple, unadorned gold band onto her finger, a ring he had fashioned himself from a small piece of the morning star's first yield, it felt more real, more valuable than any jewel-encrusted ring she had ever worn. That night, after the children were asleep, Evie sat by the fire with her old journal. She turned to a clean page, but she did not write for herself. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write a letter that would never be sent, addressed to a man who was now just a ghost in her memory. She wrote, "Dear Thomas, I heard once that you died in the desert, and I mourned for the young man I had married. Then you returned, and I saw that you had truly died long before that. Not in the desert, but in the heart of your own ambition. I do not write this with bitterness, but with a kind of sad clarity. You taught me a lesson, a hard and painful one. You taught me that a life built on money is a house built on sand. For that lesson, I suppose I am grateful, but Samuel gave me a life." She folded the letter and placed it into the heart of the fire. She watched as the edges curled, turned black, and then burst into flame, the words and the past they represented turning into smoke and ash, and rising into the vast, dark sky. Their love, hers and Samuel's, was not a perfect storybook romance. It was a gnarled and sturdy thing, like a wind-battered pine, its roots sunk deep into the hard, rocky ground of real life. It was a love that had been tested and had endured, and as she sat there, watching the flames, she thought of the banker's offer, of all the coins that could be stacked and counted. A coin, she mused, can be devalued by the stroke of a pen in some far-off city. Its worth is an illusion. But the human heart, if it is invested with trust and nurtured with kindness, will yield a dividend of joy that will last a lifetime. The years, like the creek that gave the town its name, flowed on, sometimes in a torrent, sometimes in a gentle, meandering stream. They carved new lines on the landscape of the valley and on the faces of the people who called it home. The raw, muddy wound of the great flood healed over, leaving behind scars that became part of the town's character. a reminder of both its fragility and its strength. Silver Creek did not become a great city. Its name was never spoken in the same breath as Denver or San Francisco. Its fame, such as it was of a different, quieter kind. Travelers who passed through spoke of a town in the high peaks where the miners owned the mine, where no man went hungry while his neighbor had bread, and where the scales at the assayer's office were known to be the most honest in all of Colorado. It was a town built not on a boom, but on a belief. The whitewashed cabin on the hillside grew and settled into the earth. The extra room that Samuel had built for their child was joined, over the years, by another. Their family, which had begun with 2 orphaned children, was completed by a son of their own, a boy with his father's steady blue eyes and his mother's thoughtful smile. They named him Daniel. He grew up in a world his parents had forged, a world where wealth was measured in shared meals and strong communities. He played in the rebuilt streets of the town, did his lessons in the schoolhouse where his mother taught, and learned the ways of the mountains at his father's side. He had his father's skill with his hands and his uncanny ability to read the rock. But he had his mother's love for books and a deep, abiding belief in the power of ideas. When he grew into a young man, he did not seek his fortune in some far-off city. He chose to study the new science of mining engineering, learning about structural supports, ventilation, and geology. He sought to bring knowledge and safety to the work that had sustained their town, to honor the legacy of his father's labor with the tools of his mother's philosophy. He was the living synthesis of their 2 worlds, a bridge between the hard-won wisdom of the past and the bright promise of the future. The town, in its quiet prosperity, had not forgotten its history. On a small, grassy flat beside the creek, not far from where the first raging torrents of the flood had entered the town, the people of Silver Creek had erected a small monument. It was not a grand statue of a conquering hero. It was a simple, rough-hewn block of granite, taken from the heart of the mountain itself. On its polished face, a simple sentence was carved, the words taken from a town meeting years before, words that had become the founding principle of their community. The inscription read, "There are things money can buy, but there are things only kindness can mine." Children on their way to fish in the creek would run their fingers over the cool, smooth letters, and travelers would pause to read it, a quiet testament to the gentle prospector's true and lasting legacy. Many years had passed. The seasons had turned, again and again, each one laying down another thin layer of memory, like silt in a quiet pool. Evelyn sat in a rocking chair on the porch of the cabin, a thick woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair, which had once been the color of dark honey, was now as white as the first snow on the highest peaks. The skin on her hands was a fine, soft parchment, mapped with the faint, silvery lines of a long and eventful life. In her lap lay the old, battered ledger that had served as her first journal. Its cover was worn, its pages softened by the turning of the years. The children were grown and had families of their own. Peter had become the town's blacksmith, his strong arms shaping iron and steel, while Sarah had taken over her mother's role as the school teacher. Their own son, Daniel, was now the chief engineer at the cooperative mine, his work making the lives of the miners safer than they had ever been. The cabin was quiet now, filled with the gentle, slow rhythm of a life that had found its harbor. She opened the ledger, her fingers tracing the familiar, faded script. The ink was pale, the words of a woman she had once been, a stranger from a different lifetime. She read of the fear, the cold, the terrible, biting pride that had been her only companion. Her gaze fell upon the very first line she had written on that desperate night in the storm-bound cabin, the words that had marked the true beginning of her life. Her husband's fortune vanished overnight. A slow, gentle smile touched her lips. It was a smile free of sorrow, free of bitterness. It held only a profound and quiet sense of wonder at the strange, unpredictable currents of a human life. That line was not the story of an ending. It was the story of a beginning, the breaking of a gilded cage she had not even known she was in. It was the first sentence of her own emancipation. She looked up from the page, her gaze drifting across the porch. He was there. Samuel. He was older now. His broad shoulders stooped just slightly from a lifetime of hard labor. His hair and beard were a uniform, dignified silver. He sat on the top step, carefully carving a small wooden bird for one of their grandchildren. His gnarled, scarred hands still possessed of their remarkable gentleness and skill. He must have felt her eyes upon him, for he looked up, and his gaze met hers across the small space. He smiled. It was the same slow, quiet smile that had first cracked the ice between them so many years ago. A smile that held the accumulated warmth of a shared lifetime. A love that had been tested by fire and by flood, by poverty and by the temptation of riches, and had endured. In his eyes, she saw her home. She saw her life. She saw her fortune. The air was soft with the promise of spring. From the valley below, the faint, happy sounds of the annual spring market drifted up to them on the gentle breeze, the distant, musical ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the cheerful murmur of voices, the laughter of children, and the occasional nicker of a horse. It was the sound of life, a life they had helped to build, a life that would continue long after they were gone. The meadows across the valley were awash in the pale, golden light of the late afternoon, and the world seemed to hold its breath in a moment of perfect, luminous peace. The story of Silver Creek was not a tale of a great boom or a legendary strike. It was a quieter story, a story of how a community had found its soul, and how a woman had found her life. For in the West, fortunes rise and fall as surely as the sun and moon. But human kindness, if it is cultivated with a patient heart and a steady hand, will yield a treasure that will never, ever run dry. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.